think about this. In cities like Toronto and Sydney today, it's it's not unusual for over half the population to identify with a visible minority group. It's quite a mind-blowing statistic, isn't it?
Right.
Especially when you think about the history we're about to explore in this deep dive.
It really is. And today, yeah, our focus is squarely on those historical white Australia and the de facto white Canada policies.
Right.
These were, really significant periods of exclusionary immigration.
Yeah,
Left a huge mark.
exactly. And we've gathered quite a collection of sources, historical overviews, timelines showing the policy shifts, some really insightful analyses of public feeling back then, and current demographic data too.
Hmm.
Our mission really is to understand not just what these overtly race-based policies were, but how they were actually put into practice, why they were eventually dismantled.
Yeah.
And to flag up the really striking parallels between Australia and Canada, we'll even touch on how New Zealand fits into this picture.
Right, their shared approaches.
Ultimately, we want to see how this history, maybe counterintuitively, set the stage for the incredibly diverse societies we see in these countries now.
And to do that, we'll look at the initial motivations,
Yeah.
the specific laws they used,
The tools.
the tools exactly, how national identity changed in both places, and crucially, their policies towards Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, that's vital context.
And then we'll bring it right up to the present look at current immigration trends, what their major cities actually look like today in terms of multicultural makeup.
Okay, let's dive in then. Starting with that timeline of restrictive policies. Australia first, the White Australia policy. It wasn't just switched on overnight, was it?
Oh, not at all, no. The roots, they stretch way back at the late 1800s. Think gold rushes.
Ah, right. Victoria, New South Wales.
Exactly. That's when you see the first real restrictions targeting Chinese immigrants, driven by, well, a lot of anti-Asian feeling and, frankly, fear about jobs.
That fear of cheap labor undercutting wages for white workers, that seems to pop up again and again.
It's a recurring theme, definitely. And by 1898, it was widespread. You had figures like John Forrest actually noting this strong opposition to any colored immigration,
So the stage was set.
pretty much. This feeling paved the way for the formal policy, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, right after Federation.
And the key mechanism they used was that infamous dictation test, wasn't it?
That's the one. It's quite revealing, actually. A seemingly neutral test, 50 words in a European language.
Which they could later change to any language just to make sure.
Exactly, making it basically impossible for anyone they didn't want. It shows how you can embed discrimination within seemingly objective rules.
A clever but deeply insidious tool. And it wasn't just the dictation test, was it? There was other legislation around the same time.
Right, you had the Pacific Island Laborers Act, also 1901, that was specifically designed to deport Pacific Islanders, the Kanakas, who'd been brought over, often under terrible conditions, for the sugar plantations.
So the goal was crystal clear.
Utterly. Preserve Australia's British ethnic character.
Oh,
Maintain that white British dominance.
And this policy, it had broad support for decades, even from unions.
Remarkably broad, yeah. Across the political divide, trade unions, the Labour Party, they were largely on board for a long time.
And the demographic impact must have been huge.
Oh, it was stark. By 1947, something like 97% of the population was born either in Australia or the British Isles. The Asian-born population just plummeted from about 1.25% in 1901 down to barely 0.2% by the late 40s.
Wow. So a very, very white Australia by the mid-20th century. But then World War II happens, things start to shift slowly.
Yes, the post-war era is where you see the first cracks appearing. It was slow, but significant. The Chifley Labor government in 47 took some very small steps, allowed a few non-Europeans and maybe business people, some refugees from Europe.
But the preference was still very much for white Europeans, the beautiful Balts.
Oh, absolutely. That preference remains strong. But you also had the whole populate or perish idea after the war.
Right, the need for labor.
Exactly. That practical need forced a slight loosening, even if the ideology hadn't fully shifted yet.
And then Menzies and the liberals in the 50s took it further.
They did. Menzies' reforms were quite important. In 49, they allowed non-European refugees and war brides.
Yeah.
Then, 1957, citizenship for non-Europeans who'd been there long term.
Okay.
And the really big one, abolishing the dictation test in the 1958 Migration Act.
So definite steps away from the overt racism. Still cautious, though.
Very cautious.
Yeah.
But movement nonetheless.
But the real push to dismantle it properly came in the 60s, right? With changing global attitudes and more internal critique.
Absolutely. You had academic papers like Immigration, Control, or Color Bar,
Yeah.
in 63, really questioning the morality of it all.
Challenging a basis.
Exactly. And politically, Harold Holt's liberal government made a landmark change in 1966. They eased the race-based criteria, cut the waiting time for citizenship for non-Europeans from 15 years down to 5.
Yeah, that's a big drop.
Huge. And they started admitting skilled non-white immigrants, allowed family reunion. Holt still called it a restricted policy, but I mean, the writing was on the wall.
Even his successor, Gorton, started talking about a multiracial society.
Yeah, albeit cautiously, but the idea was entering the mainstream.
And then the final nails in the coffin came with the Whitlam Labor government, early 70s.
Yes, 73 to 75. That's when we see the explicit rejection, the removal of all the remaining bits of the White Australia policy.
How does they do that?
Whitlam's government amended the immigration laws, specifically prohibited racial discrimination, make citizenship equal for everyone after 3 years. And then the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975 basically outlawed using race in any official decisions.
So that was it. The definitive end of the whites-only idea.
Pretty much. It shows how, global norms shifting and domestic pressure coming together can really force change, maybe even more than just a sudden moral awakening.
And the transformation since then, it's just incredible. Multiculturalism, skill-based immigration, that population boom, over 6.5 million migrants since 45.
Yeah, and now, 34% born overseas?
It's a total turnaround. Okay, let's pivot to Canada, their white Canada approach, a similar story arc.
Similar arc, yes, but with its own Canadian flavor, you could say. Like Australia, late 1800s, the focus was definitely on white immigrants. British, Northern European farmers were preferred.
And early anti-Chinese laws there, too.
Oh, yes. The Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 and the head tax. Started at $50, but by 1903 it was $500.
$500? That was an enormous amount of money back then.
Astronomical. Clearly designed to deter people. Didn't stop everyone, especially with railway construction needing labor, but it was a huge barrier.
And then that continuous journey regulation from 1908, that sounds quite sneaky.
It was insidious, yeah. It required immigrants to come via a continuous journey from their country of origin.
Which is impossible for most people coming from India or Asia at the time.
Practically impossible. There were no direct shipping routes, so it effectively blocked them. The Komagata Maru incident in 1914 is the tragic example of that policy in action.
So by the early 1900s, Canada had this clear hierarchy.
Absolutely. British and Northern Europeans, top tier. Southern, Eastern Europeans, less desired. Non-Europeans, actively discouraged or excluded. White Canada wasn't just a slogan, it shaped policy.
And similar to Australia, once big projects like the railway were done, the calls to exclude the workers who built them got louder, especially targeting the Chinese community.
Exactly, which leads us to the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, often just called the Chinese Exclusion Act.
That sounds pretty final.
It pretty much was, a near total ban. For 24 years, almost no Chinese people were allowed into Canada, maybe fewer than 50 in total.
24 years?
Yeah. It's known as Humiliation Day in the Chinese-Canadian community, July 1st, when the act took effect. This whole period, really from the late 1800s up to the 40s, was overtly racist policy. Officials weren't shy about aiming for a white man's country.
How did they screen people?
Based on nationality, perceived customs and habits, ability to assimilate, which always favored whites. And crucially, this was happening alongside policies denying rights to Indigenous peoples, viewing their cultures as something to be eradicated.
It's a grim picture. But again, like Australia, World War II and the aftermath started to change things.
Yes. The horror of Nazi racism really discredited those kinds of ideas on the world stage. Plus, you had decolonization, the rise of civil rights movement.
Just created pressure.
Immense pressure. So, 1947, Canada repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese immigration then fell under general law, but still quite restricted, mainly spouses and children of existing residents, small quotas.
And other groups started gaining some rights around then, too.
Yes, slowly. Indo-Canadians, Japanese Canadians, things started to shift bit by bit.
The 1950s saw more gradual reforms. Was international image a factor?
Definitely. Canada was trying to position itself on the world stage, joining the UN, criticizing apartheid. It became harder to justify its own discriminatory laws at home. So you saw a slight expansion of family reunification for Asians, for example, but not European immigration, still very small numbers.
Okay, so the big shift, the real turning point, sounds like 1962 under Diefenbaker.
Absolute pivotal moment. Diefenbaker's progressive conservative government, with Ellen Fairclough as immigration minister, who was herself an immigrant, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
They removed most of the overt racial discrimination from the rules. The focus shifted to education, skills, merit. That was effectively the end of the white Canada preference system.
Why then? What drove Diefenbaker?
A mix of things, probably. A genuine commitment to a non-racial Canadian identity, perhaps. But also pragmatism. Canada needed immigrants, needed allies in the Cold War world. Discrimination wasn't a good look.
And that set the stage for the point system in 67.
Exactly. The 1967 immigration regulations brought in that universal point system. Age, education, language skills, job prospects, objective criteria, at least on paper.
No more judging based on race or origin.
That was the idea. But this was cemented in the Immigration Act of 1976-77. Overt racial restrictions were gone. And around the same time, Canada officially adopts multiculturalism as a policy in 71.
Valuing diversity, not just tolerating it.
That was the shift. And like Australia, the decades since have seen huge growth in immigration from all over. The foreign-born population in Canada hit over 23% by 2021.
So looking back at both, you see these really low points for foreign-born populations mid-century.
Yeah, a real dip. Australia went from maybe 30% overseas born in the late 19th century down to only about 10% by the 1940s.
Wow, only 10%.
Then climbed back up, now over 30% again. Canada saw a similar pattern, dipped, then rebounded, reaching its highest proportion in a century just recently.
And the source countries completely changed, didn't they?
That's the key insight, I think. It wasn't just more immigrants, it was immigrants from everywhere. A total shift away from just Europe, reshaping the demographics in ways the original policy architects could never have imagined.
It really is striking how parallel those experiences were, despite the distance.
It is. And when you dig down, the reasons are often quite similar, too.
Like the underlying racial ideology, that idea of preserving a British white nation.
Exactly. It was explicit in Australia, maintain the British character. In Canada, maybe slightly less explicit sometimes, but that desire for an Anglo-European character was definitely there. Both were influenced by that awful scientific racism of the era.
These pseudoscientific beliefs used to justify ranking races.
Unfortunately, yes. And they seeped into policy.
And the economic fears, we touched on that, huge driver in both.
Massive. Fear of cheap Asian labor undercutting white workers' wages. You saw labor unions, working-class whites strongly supporting exclusion in both countries.
That created some odd political alliances, especially in Australia.
It did. And in Canada, economic downturns often seemed to dial up the anti-immigrant rhetoric.
And both linked this to building a nation, right? Immigration policy as a tool for defining who belonged.
Precisely. Australia for the Australians, meaning white Australians. The whole white Canada discourse. They saw themselves really as extensions of Britain, of the British race.
It's also fascinating how similar the tools were. We mentioned the dictation test and the continuous journey rule.
Yeah, different mechanisms, same goal, exclusion based on race, disguised as something else.
And the head taxes on Chinese immigrants. Both did that.
Both did that. Both favored immigrants from Britain and parts of Europe with assisted passage. Both had discriminatory citizenship and voting laws that kept non-white residents disenfranchised for ages.
And the public, sadly, seemed largely okay with this at the time.
For a long time, yes. You had anti-Asian riots, Vancouver in 1907, violence against Chinese communities in Australia. The media often played a big role, pushing those yellow peril stereotypes. Politicians saw votes in it.
Which makes it interesting that the dismantling often started under more conservative governments, like Diefenbaker in Canada, Holt in Australia.
That is interesting, isn't it? Though it usually needed broader bipartisan support to really get done. By the 60s, leaders across the spectrum started seeing it was morally wrong, bad for the international image, and often economically counterproductive.
And while the end of the official policies didn't magically erase prejudice,
No, of course not.
both countries have transformed. They now often celebrate the multi-ethnic reality that's so different from their past goals.
A complete 180. And, New Zealand fits into this picture, too, often lumped together as the white dominions.
Right. They also prioritize British immigrants.
Very much so. And they had their own restrictions on Asian immigration. New Zealand's Chinese Immigrants Act of 1881 imposed a poll tax, much like the Canadian head tax. Same desire for an Anglo-Saxon society, open doors for Brits, barriers for others.
So similar laws again, exclusion acts, poll taxes.
Yeah, by the 1920s, all three, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, had measures specifically aimed at keeping non-Europeans out. They even compared notes at imperial conferences.
Really? Sharing strategies.
Seems like it. And think about their united front against Japan's proposal for a racial equality clause at the League of Nations after WWI. Australia led the charge, NZ supported, Canada tacitly agreed. They were aligned on keeping immigration white.
So, while maybe not formal joint policies, there was an understanding, a shared goal.
Definitely an implicit consensus. Keep the dominions white. They watched each other, watched Britain. Even things like the post-war Colombo Plan, bringing Asian students over, was a kind of engagement, but without fully opening the immigration doors yet.
So they moved in tandem, broadly speaking, didn't
Right.
want to be the odd one out.
Exactly. There wasn't a formal pact, but the policies mirrored each other closely. When one started to shift in the 50s or 60s, the others weren't far behind. By the 70s, all three were presenting themselves as multicultural nations, a shared journey from exclusion to inclusion.
And this shift in immigration ran alongside changes in how they saw themselves, their national identities, moving beyond just being British subjects.
Yes, absolutely intertwined. Canada actually went first on creating its own distinct citizenship, the Canadian Citizenship Act,
Oh.
effective 1947, a big step away from just being British subjects overseas.
Asserting nationhood after the war.
Right. Australia followed pretty quickly with its Nationality and Citizenship Act, effective 1949, influenced by Canada and by the UK changing its own nationality laws.
But the legal change is one thing. Did people feel differently right away? Did the psychology shift that fast?
That took longer, definitely. In Canada, getting a new flag in 1965, Trudeau pushing bilingualism and multiculturalism, those were big symbolic moments.
Australia held on to the British symbols longer. Blue ensign, God save the Queen.
Yeah, the shift felt maybe a bit more gradual there. But things like Britain joining the European Economic Community, changing demographics within Australia itself that fostered a more independent identity over time. And scrapping the white Australia policy was a huge part of saying, we are our own nation, not just a British outpost.
So Canada maybe led slightly on the formal citizenship and multiculturalism policy, but both eventually forged distinct identities separate from Britain.
Exactly. And we absolutely have to remember, while all this was happening with immigration, both countries were simultaneously enacting devastating policies against their own Indigenous populations.
Aiming for assimilation, the residential schools in Canada, the stolen generations in Australia, such incredibly dark chapters.
Truly horrific. Canada's residential schools ran for over a century, forcibly removing about 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children. The goal was explicit.
Yeah.
Assimilate them, destroy their cultures and languages. Abuse was rampant.
Australia's stolen generations.
Similar goal, different methods sometimes. Forced removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, especially mixed-race kids, from the early 1900s into the 70s. Put into institutions, foster care. Again, assimilation, sometimes framed as biological absorption. Terrible conditions, abuse, loss of identity.
The scale was huge in both cases.
Devastating. Estimates for Australia suggest maybe 1 in 10, even up to 1 in 3, Indigenous children were taken in some areas over that period.
So different systems, large schools in Canada, more varied removals in Australia, but the same basic racist ideology.
Fundamentally the same. A belief in white superiority, the need to erase Indigenous cultures. Kill the Indian in the child was the phrase used in Canada. It went hand in hand with denying basic citizenship rights for decades. Aboriginal Australians weren't even fully counted in the census or guaranteed to vote federally until 1967. Many First Nations in Canada didn't get the federal vote without losing their status until 1960.
Just like with immigration, though, there's been a reckoning in recent decades. Apologies, commissions.
Yes, a slow and painful process of acknowledging the truth. The Bringing Them Home report in Australia in '97 was huge. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, reporting in 2015, laid bare the history of residential schools.
And formal apologies followed?
Yes, Prime Minister Harper apologized for residential schools in 2008. Prime Minister Rudd apologized to the stolen generations in 2008. But, apologies are just the start. Reconciliation is ongoing, complex work-land claims, treaties, addressing systemic inequality.
It highlights that the exclusionary mindset wasn't just about borders, it was internal, too.
Absolutely. A society trying to define itself as white applied that logic both outwards and inwards.
Okay, bringing us towards the present day. Modern immigration trends. Both countries now major immigrant destinations, right?
Huge destinations. Since ditching those racist policies, immigration has soared. Skilled migration, family reunion are key drivers.
And India and China are now massive source countries for both.
Top two, consistently in recent years. Canada's aiming for, maybe 500,000 permanent residents a year soon? Australia's intake is also very high, around 160,000 to 200,000 permanent migrants annually, plus lots of temporary ones. And yes, India and China dominate those numbers. In Australia, the India-born population, recently overtook the China-born population.
That's a significant shift, and it's changed the face of these countries.
Completely. In Canada, over a quarter of the population identifies as a visible minority that's projected to be over a third by 2041. South Asians and Chinese are the largest groups.
And Australia.
Asian Australians are over 17% now. Rapid growth, especially from India, but also significant populations from the Philippines, Vietnam, South Africa, Nepal, the Middle East. It's truly global now, alongside, of course, still significant numbers from places like England and New Zealand.
And this diversity isn't just numbers, it's culture, economy.
Absolutely. Skilled workers, powering industries, IT, engineering, healthcare, often from India. Students and entrepreneurs, especially from China, filling labor gaps, driving innovation. And culturally, restaurants, festivals like Diwali and Lunar New Year are mainstream now. Different languages heard everywhere. Punjabi is the third language in the Canadian Parliament.
Incredible. And this diversity is mainly concentrated in the big cities.
Overwhelmingly. Let's compare, say, Toronto and Sydney, both incredibly diverse global cities.
Okay, Toronto.
Around 46% foreign-born. Over half the population identifies as a visible minority. Largest groups are South Asian, then Chinese. Huge diversity in the suburbs, too, like Brampton. It's a real mosaic.
And Sydney.
Similar story. Maybe 37–40% foreign-born, big populations from China, India, but also historically significant numbers from England, Vietnam, the Philippines, Lebanon, maybe 20% of Asian descent overall, plus significant Middle Eastern communities.
So different mixes, but both hyper-diverse. What about Vancouver versus Melbourne?
Vancouver's known for its huge Asian influence. About 42% foreign-born, nearly half visible minority. Chinese diaspora is particularly large, around 20% of the population. Also a large South Asian community.
And Melbourne.
Historically strong European migration, especially post-war. Now, about 35% overseas-born, rapid growth from India, big Chinese and Vietnamese communities too. Also Sri Lankan, growing African communities, maybe more South Asian overall than Vancouver, while Sydney has more Middle Eastern concentration. But again, very multicultural.
And you see patterns like ethnic enclaves, but also a lot of mixing.
Yeah, both. You might have areas known for particular communities like Chatswood or Harris Park in Sydney, or Surrey near Vancouver. But there's also a lot of diffusion, people living side by side. Intermarriage rates are reasonably high too.
But outside the big cities, it's often a different picture, that urban-rural divide.
That's a really key point for both countries. The vast interiors, the rural areas, they tend to be much less diverse ethnically. Often older European-descended populations, and some regions, significant indigenous populations. This sometimes plays into political divides too.
Beyond immigration, are there other big similarities between Australia and Canada? They feel similar in some ways.
They really do. Geographically,
Asia.
both are enormous countries with relatively small populations, heavily concentrated in a few big urban belts along the southern border or coast.
Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver.
Exactly. Huge distances, low overall density, challenges connecting remote areas. That frontier aspect is part of both identities, maybe? Outback versus the north.
And their economies. Resource-based.
Historically, very much so. Minerals, energy, agriculture are huge for both. Exporting raw materials, importing manufactured goods makes them vulnerable to commodity price swings. Both trying to diversify, of course.
And both facing major climate change impacts.
Absolutely on the front lines. Bushfires in Australia, wildfires and melting permafrost in Canada. Big challenges balancing resource extraction with environmental protection. High per capita emissions for both, too.
And the housing market, we have to mention that.
Oh, yeah. Off the charts prices in the big cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Vancouver, Toronto, are consistently among the world's most expensive.
Why is that? Similar reasons.
Seems like it. High demand, partly from immigration, limited supply in desirable areas, history of low interest rates, foreign investment plays a role. Both have tried things like foreign buyer taxes. Housing affordability is a massive political issue in both countries.
But despite that, it's still high standards of living overall.
Generally, yes. Both consistently rank highly for quality of life. Stable democracies, good healthcare and education systems, or relatively safe cities. That's part of why they attract so many immigrants.
And culturally, too. Sports mat, outdoorsy.
Definitely. Love their sports footy, cricket, ice hockey, etc. Big outdoors culture. Commonwealth heritage means similar parliamentary systems. Maybe that shared informal friendliness, sorry, and no worries.
Huh, yeah, maybe. Obvious differences, too, like climate and Canada's official bilingualism.
Of course. But the overlaps are striking. Federal systems, similar political spectrums, often with minority governments, grappling with similar issues. Immigration, climate, Indigenous reconciliation, housing.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive, it's really shown these parallel histories, hasn't it? Australia and Canada both setting up these exclusionary white policies.
Driven by very similar racial ideas, economic worries, and concepts of nation building.
We looked at the tools they use, the tests, the taxes, the regulations.
And how they eventually dismantled them, moving towards multiculturalism, but also the really deep and ongoing legacies, especially regarding Indigenous peoples.
And the incredible demographic change, particularly in the cities, driven by immigration from places like India and China after those policies ended.
A complete reshaping.
So for you listening, we hope this has given you a solid, thorough overview, pulling out the key threads from all that history and data.
And maybe the big aha moment here is just that stark contrast, isn't it, between the explicit goal of exclusion back then
Yeah.
and the reality of these incredibly diverse, often proudly multicultural societies today. How countries that define themselves by who they kept out now often celebrate the contributions of those they've welcomed in.
It's quite the journey. And hopefully by focusing on those milestones, those parallels, those key shifts, it's felt clear and manageable, not just a huge data dump.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Sure.
How much do these historical policies still shape things today? Social dynamics, debates about immigration, national identity, those ongoing reconciliation efforts. What does this shared history tell us about the challenges, the complexities of actually building societies that are truly inclusive for everyone?
Something to chew on. Definitely encourage you to look deeper into the sources or related topics if this has sparked your interest.